Good afternoon and welcome to week 12. We're on the week from the 19th of March to the 26th of March, and we're reading from Judges. We started this week basically at Judges 6:1, and we'll make it through to 1 Samuel chapter 1. Thrown in there is also Ruth, because our editor, F. LaGard Smith, is of the opinion, and I think he's right, that Ruth is covering a time within the period of Judges. Now, the overview of what's going on in Judges is this. Effectively, the Israelites have captured the bulk of what became the kingdom of Israel. They were supposed to completely obliterate and kill, is the way I read it, all the Canaanites that lived on the western side of the Jordan River and the west side of the Dead Sea. We know from our reading that they didn't quite do that. We know there were still Jebusites. We know there were still Gibeonites. We know there were, and they're listed as peoples that were not, in fact, completely conquered. So what happens throughout the period of the Judges is that time passes, the Israelites become complacent, I guess would be a good word, and they begin to fall in with bad habits. They are not consistently worshiping the true God. They are worshiping Baals and Asherah poles rather than God, the Creator. And the cycle repeats itself because they let that happen enough, and eventually God allows enemies to come in and cause trouble for the nation of Israel. Finally, the people will cry out, "We need the Lord," which of course was true to begin with, and then a judge is raised up who will help them and understand that God is the be-all and end-all. So that's the cycle of Judges. It happens over and over again. So right before we start, I've chosen a few high points to discuss. Right before we do that, I'd like to look at the map once more. And so now, essentially, all of the areas shown in color here are now in the possession of the Israelites. Now, there is no uniform government at this point. There is no king. And there is clearly some, I don't know if animosity is the right word, but an element of distrust between the tribes on the west bank of the Jordan River and the tribes on the east bank of the Jordan River. I don't know exactly why that exists, but that does seem to exist. A couple of high points. Shechem is located there. There's Jerusalem. So we're in the area of Samaria. Samaria will ultimately fall to the Assyrians. All of this area will later become the property of the Assyrians. But Shechem is near Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. So, and at this point, maybe not right now, but at some point in the immediate future within our reading, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and the Ark of the Covenant ends up at Shiloh. So this is where the tabernacle is during most of the time we're reading about it in Judges. So we'll begin with just a little discussion of Gideon. I find him most interesting. As I said a moment ago, this is how the judgeship cycle seems to start typically. Joshua 6:1 says, "Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord." So what happens? Well, at this point, the Midianites came into the land with their camels. And that's an interesting observation. It specifically says that within our reading that the Midianites had numerous camels. And our editor tells us, which I did not know, that the first known use of camels in war was by the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. So these are the Midianites. So the people cry out, as they are wont to do, "Lord, please help us." And an angel of the Lord comes to Gideon. Now, the angel instructs him that he's to be a brave warrior and he's going to help the people. And the angel tells him to go prepare a sacrifice. Gideon places the sacrifice on a stone. The angel touches said stone with its staff, with his or her staff, and shazam, the whole thing goes up in smoke miraculously. So Gideon would seem to be somewhat convinced that this is really an angel of the Lord, not just somebody pretending to be an angel of the Lord. What I next find interesting is that we discover in the course of the reading that Gideon's own father had an altar to Baal. And Gideon has to destroy that. Well, that's a good start. Then Gideon, I sense, kind of loses confidence. And so he says, well, I'd like to put out a fleece and make sure that tomorrow morning I want the fleece to be wet with dew, and I want all the ground around it to be dry. God does not reprimand him for this lack of faith. God simply complies with the request. And then Gideon does it again. He said, well, this time I want it to be the other way around. I want the fleece to be dry and the ground to be wet. And again, the Lord does not reprimand him. He simply complies with the request. At that point, Gideon decides, yes, I have been summoned by God. So God wants to attack the Midianites, or he wants Gideon and his people to attack the Midianites. So Gideon raises a cry throughout the land, and a lot of soldiers show up, a lot of warriors arrive. God says, well, this isn't good. No, I don't want that many warriors, because I want it to be clear that the victory was due to my help. I don't want you to believe that you made this happen. I want it to be clear that this was God's hand that did this. So ultimately, through a very odd sorting path, Gideon sorts it down to 300 men. And remember, this is the dog lapping. He takes only, I think if I remember it right, he takes only the men who lapped water like a dog at the drinking fountain, or maybe it's backwards, I don't know. But in any event, with only 300 men in the dark, basically, they sneak up on the Midianites, surround the camp, 300 men, there are far more than that Midianites, and they blow their horns, smash their globes so that the torches are visible, and shazam, great victory. There are a lot of other little details that go on here, but the long and short of it is that the Midianites are soundly defeated, and this is quite remarkable, 40 years of peace ensue. So Gideon was eminently successful in making the land safe for the people of Israel. And I said Gideon did it. No, God did it, but Gideon was his warrior. And here again, we see the unfortunate behavior of broken families. Abimelech, Gideon's son, wants to be a king, even though there is no king in Israel. Abimelech wants to be a king, And how sad, he murders all of his brothers and says that he's the only one who can replace Gideon. So needless to say, that is a horrid outcome. And once again, the land gradually falls into sin. Now, there are several more judges in our reading. We're not going to discuss them all. I will jump directly to Ruth, because I find this to be a most encouraging story. Ruth was a Moabitess. And if you recall, we were just looking at the map a moment ago. The Moabites, the country of Moab, is located on the eastern bank south of the areas owned or controlled by Israel. And Naomi and her husband moved to Moab during a famine in Israel, probably brought about because of God's anger at increasing evil within the country of Israel. And her husband dies after her son marries Ruth. So Naomi returned, and both her sons died, incidentally. So at that point, she is a woman with no male leadership. She decides her only hope is to return to Israel. So they've been living in Moab. And Ruth and the other wife of the other son, they are traveling with her, but she warns them, when we go back to Israel, I will not have another son. Even if I had one tomorrow, you could not wait for my son to grow up and become your husband. So you need to go back to your home, and I will go back to Israel. And Ruth said, and this is a great testament of confidence in God, I would say, Ruth said to Naomi, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. So in fact, Ruth and Naomi return to Israel. In Israel, Naomi very cleverly recognizes that in gleaning in the fields of Boaz, that she is gleaning in the fields of a kinsman redeemer. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is that, recall the rules that we read 2 weeks ago. If a man dies, his wife is to be taken by his brother as a wife, so that the family name will not extinguish due to that death. And Boaz is in that line. Since the other brother is already dead, Boaz is the next kinsman redeemer, or one of the next. So ultimately, Boaz calls a meeting at the city gates and says, I'm prepared to marry Ruth. If any of you want to marry Ruth before me because you're ahead on the list, speak up now or forever hold your peace. And lo and behold, Boaz marries Ruth. I find that whole thing comforting, that God is looking after Ruth. And here's the amazing thing. Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of David, the king of Israel. David's kingdom was not the largest it ever became. His son Solomon made it a little bigger, but David turned it into a much bigger kingdom. And here's the last part of that remarkableness. In Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus, Rahab, the person from Jericho, and Ruth, the Moabitess, are both in the genealogy, the family tree, I should say, of Jesus. What an honor. So this story does show that even in Old Testament times, God rewarded faithfulness and belief in his power. So the last of the judges, although I don't know if Samson is really a judge or not. He does not have very good leadership qualities, but he's a great hero of Israel. And he's kind of a type in a way, because he is the sole offspring of a woman who was barren and prayed for a son. And Samson was in fact that son. So an angel tells her she is going to have a son, and instructs both her and her husband that this son is to be a Nazirite from birth, meaning no alcoholic beverages, no shaving the head, beard, etc. So once again, a goat and grain are sacrificed, and once again, a miraculous flame is produced, and then the angel ascends to heaven in the flame. So again, the mother and father are convinced that yes, indeed, that was an angel. And yes, Samson is born, and he is in fact maintaining a Nazirite existence. He is not consuming booze. He's not eating of bad things, but he is living a very wild life. He loves women from outside. He's in love with Philistine women. I don't know why that is exactly, but he is amazingly strong, and he does wild things with his strength. So his second, as far as I can figure out, his second non-Jewish wife is the famous Delilah, and she is a Philistine, and she ultimately sells him out, she keeps badgering him to tell her why he's so strong. He ultimately confesses that, well, if I were to shave my head so I'm no longer a Nazirite, my strength would disappear. She shaves his head, he is captured, and they gouge out his eyes so that he can no longer perform these feats of strength, even though he doesn't have those abilities. And the end of that story is that when he cries out to the Lord, when he's being taunted and he's blind, and he's in the temple of Dagon, he cries out to the Lord, "Help me this one time, Lord, to have strength." And the Lord gives him strength, and he single-handedly destroys the temple of Dagon, and it says that he killed more Philistines in his death than he killed when he was alive. Another amazing story of God responding to cries for help. So that's a huge encouragement to me, because I constantly need help, and I think we all do. So what's pretty much the last thing that's said in Judges? It is as follows. In Judges 21, verse 25, "In those days, Israel had no king," period. "Everyone did as he saw fit." And that's the problem, wasn't it? Throughout the period of the Judges. So at the very end of our reading, we read about another barren woman, Hannah, who pleads with the Lord for a child. And indeed, Samuel is born. And Samuel is the last judge prior to the coming of the kingdom of David. Or excuse me, of Saul, the coming of the kingdom of Saul. So this is pretty much the end of the period of the Judges. We look forward to reading more about the kingdom developing.